In the early 1950s, two artists from East Pakistan traveled through London and showed their work there. Today, each is considered a protagonist in the story of Bangladeshi art. But back then, the roots and reception of Zainul Abedin and SM Sultan could hardly have been more different. Comparing their journeys crystallizes the instability of London as a site through which South Asian artists might travel, as well as opening up the category of the journey as a form of movement that calibrates different possibilities and limitations for South Asian artists in the years immediately following 1947. We assume that journey is constitutive of artistic practice, drawing on Tim Ingold's notion of making as a form of procession, quote, a passage along a path in which every step grows from the one before it and into the one following on an itinerary that always overshoots its destination, unquote. This shared theme of journey is for us a stimulus to think about the economies of encounter that marked artists and artworks traveling within the networks of post-war modernism.
The immediate post-independence decade of the 1950s, that's what we are focusing on, is useful here, for it captures a temporality that was both active and uneasy, committed to cultural exchange, yet unresolved in the structural assimilation of the modernity of former colonies within the ways of showing, telling, seeing in the metropolis. Given the fact that for both artists, Sultan and Abedin, the period following their journey through London has been described as one of a certain form of absence. Both of these artists sunk, for instance, into the ethnographic or the folk in different but equally unesteemed ways. For both of them, the journey, as inevitably one of a productive overshooting of destinations and ends, is a helpful way for conceptualizing the place of London within the works of these two artists. The questions we are posing in this paper is an open-ended one without any a priori commitment to tracing modernism's transnational promises. What did the journeying and exhibiting in London mean for these artists from East Pakistan? This dialogue is also here one between a historian and anthropologist. That is between two disciplines that face art history with different methods and a different set of aspirations. I'll move on to the first section where I'll talk about Abedin and Lotte will take on Sultan from that point. So my section is titled Zainul Abedin and the Journeys of Allegory. Zainul Abedin came to London in 1951 on a Commonwealth scholarship to join the Slade School of Art as an official representative of the government of Pakistan. By then, he was the principal of the Dhaka Art College, an institution he had struggled to build after migrating to East Bengal, East Pakistan post-partition, through a series of negotiations and commissions from the federal government of Pakistan in Karachi. London would be his first official international journey and one heavily marked as such by these recent histories of displacement and reconstruction. In London, Abedin exhibited in 3 locations, and these locations are marked by certain kinds of institutional ideologies. First was the Burlington House, the seat, of course, of the Royal Academy of Arts. The second was the Imperial Institute, which would soon become the Commonwealth Institute in 1961. This was organized by the Royal India, Pakistan, and Ceylon Society, December 1951. And the third was supported by the Pakistan High Commission, took place at the Berkeley Galleries. Now, this dense institutional patronage for Abedin, however, breaks down on further probing. From the sketchy information available, we gather that Abedin had to carry his sketches and watercolors himself without government support to have them exhibited. The works had to be smaller, lighter, for easy packaging, suggesting a curious mix of informal and formal economies. At the center of Abedin's London exhibition were his famine drawings. Now, many people in this room might be familiar with the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1943, which made Zainul Abedin famous within the art circuits of, Calcutta to begin with. Now, this was the first time these famine drawings were being exhibited outside India and Pakistan, as far as I know. You can correct me. It was probably also the first time viewers in London would witness sketches of the notorious Bengal famine, wartime famine of 43, ill-famed to be manufactured by wartime profiteering and strategic lapses of the colonial government. These sketches were also, in a way, raw trails of late colonialism, not sketched or photographed by travelers, artists, or cartoonists in the West, but produced from an entirely different optic by an artist and a colonial subject walking the streets of a famine-struck late colonial Calcutta, marking in pen and ink a radical shift towards social realism in Indian art. Now, how were these images viewed in London? And these information I could gather because of some random private collection in Dhaka, completely by surprise, and it's wonderful. So introducing Abedin at the Imperial Institute, Nazir Ahmed, Abedin's friend and admirer from his Dhaka and Calcutta and Dhaka days, and an employee of the BBC at that point of time, describes him as a visualizer of both grime and poverty. An artist, and I quote, giving us emotional clue to visualize both hunger and beauty that marks, and I quote again, the beautiful country of our own. To understand Abedin, he says, and I quote, Western viewers will have to look through the Orient's eye, unquote. Ahmed's use of we and our is more than that of the solidarity of friends. They echo the publicness of national allegory, Abedin's art signifying the trials and triumphs of both the nation and the nation-state. Abedin himself was committed to this rhetoric and its affective politics. His work from the late 1950s, 1951, early 1950s, capture not only a struggle for survival, but also idioms of movement, labor, leisure. Abedin presents the typical instance of a post-colonial artist, bureaucrat, taking on the allegorical task of representing both the people and the state. Journeys of artists like him became a part of this double coding, an artistic self ever inscribed by the narratives of the collective. Such doubling of the artist's public and private address were also tied to the ways in which post-war art staged itself globally. Abedin's London spell was the first in the line of a series of international trips. For instance, from London, he would go to Paris, Brussels, Ankara, and then further on to join the Venice Biennale at the UNESCO's International Conference of Artists in 1952 as Pakistan's official representative. And further down, he would go to Japan, United States, and finally Soviet Union in the early 60s. These journeys marked a trail through a global post-war language of cultural exchange and travel that was officially on the agenda of forums like the UNESCO, patronized also by the movement and ideologies of international art funds like the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, and so on. Yet, the burden of allegory that Abedin carried in his journey was not a fully resolved one. While Nazir Ahmed had claimed him as the nation's artist, for reviewers in London, his journey carried other allegories. To Maurice Collis, the art critic of Art News, Time and Tide here was an arrival, also an arduous quest, one that is necessary, and I'm quoting, one that is necessary if those parts of Asia which have gained their political independence are also to gain their cultural independence, unquote. To Eric Newton, who was also a friend to Abedin, correct me if he also became involved with the Commonwealth Institute, I think. He became the curator or something. So Eric Newton, introducing the Burlington House exhibition, says that Abedin stood for an ambiguous artist who combined, and I quote, the contemplative temperament of an Oriental with the quick journalistic observation of a European. And I quote again, it is as though the Oriental hand, holding the brush in the traditional Oriental way, and using nothing but fluent black ink and water on absorbent paper, has been guided by the European eye. And mind you, he's commenting on the famine sketches, right? So even in his other watercolors were normal life. So I imagine this to be, the genre of painting that fall under other watercolors. So in other watercolors where normal life was the subject matter without the need for urgency, the spacing of the main masses is Oriental, observed fact is Oriental, again and again placing of each feature on the papers is reminiscent of Asia, yet the detail itself might have been drawn by English watercolorists. This to me is a rhetorical telling of ambiguity, almost purposefully kept unresolved. The epistemic distance that held apart the colony and the metropolis reinforced rather than explored. I'm not saying the distance is not there, but walk through it. London triggered Abedin's foray into printmaking, linear simplifications, seen by his contemporaries as a turn towards abstraction of international modernism. Between 1952-53 and post-53, Abedin can be seen to experiment in linear simplifications, breaking up the image, trying out semi-cubistic figurations, and so on. His subjects remain the same, however: peasants, laborers, domestic subject, while the artist seems momentarily lured by the language of modernism while holding on to a commitment to the rural. During and in these years following London, Abedin as an artist pedagogue can be seen to grapple with this curious tension between creativity and pedagogy, a tension around allegory itself, I would say. These artistic tensions, triggered by the post-colonial journeys, seem to signify a transitional aesthetic of decolonization, where modernity is hinged between context and the universal. In this case, between the image of the peasant and that of Cubism. What is striking for us at this moment is that this moment does not last, this particular moment of abstraction. Rather than marking a shift in his aesthetic and his method, London becomes a transient moment. And I'll try to come back to this question of transience after Lotte talks about Sultan.
Right, so SM Sultan, his journey to and through London is rather different from that of Zainul Abedin, and I'll try and lay out how and why. So if the contemporaneous accounts are anything to go by, major transitions in Sultan's work unfold over the first half of the 1950s in Sultan's work that appear to coincide with his international travel. Retrospectively, too, these years before Sultan's famous reclusion in the village of Narail are credited with great importance. Art News mentions that, quote, the first work Nadia Samdani collected was a watercolor by the Bohemian Bangladeshi modernist SM Sultan, the only Bangladeshi artist to exhibit alongside Picasso, Dali, and Braque at the Victoria Embankment Gardens, Hampstead, London in 1950, unquote. Closer inspection of Sultan's international travels and such facts about his London period reveal perhaps a slightly different story based on a rather evanescent archive. It is only in January 1952 that Sultan travels outside of South Asia and to the US via a project of the Institute of International Education to bring, quote, young foreign artists, unquote, to the United States, supported by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. This part of the international travel was organized and timetabled closely by the Institute. The part that followed was not. According to his biographer, Abdul Hasnat Hai, and we have to put a footnote here to say this is a slightly fictionalized biography, nonetheless, Sultan decided to stop over in London for a few days on his way home from the US to Pakistan. He was received by his great friends Khan Atur Rahman and Fateh Lohani, fellow Bohemians with a great interest in the dramatic and visual arts. Rather than a few days, however, Sultan stayed in London for the better part of a year. This unscripted extension of Sultan's US journey would have been the moment that retrospectively allows an equation to be made between London, modernism, and Sultan. Trying to excavate this moment, it was immediately apparent that a number of different sites and times were conflated in the received history. Hai mentions that, quote, Sultan's paintings were exhibited with those of the Hampstead Victoria Embankment Sunday artists, unquote, collating perhaps two rather different exhibition sites that both ran uncurated open-air exhibitions that attracted so-called Sunday artists in the early 1950s. In Hampstead, the Hampstead Artists Council organized such shows on the weekends, where anyone could come to exhibit whatever, while a similar open-air exhibition at the Victoria Embankment Gardens was organized annually by the London County Council. Now, it's highly possible that Sultan showed and sold his paintings through such open-air exhibitions in 1952. Because when he arrived in London, his friends Fateh Lohani, who was studying cinematography, and Khan Atur Rahman, who was playing with puppet theater, were staying above an Indian restaurant called the Taj Mahal, operated by Sylheti restaurateurs. According to Hai, the bohemian lifestyle of the friends meant a continuous drain on resources, and Sultan's arrival provided a new means of income. They encouraged him to paint, and apparently they sold his paintings in tube stations. A final settling of the bill with their Sylheti landlords was a painting of the Taj Mahal made by Sultan for the restaurant. Now, in trying to gain some sort of traction on this account, I've talked to a number of different British Bangladeshi men related to those who operated restaurants in the 1950s. On one occasion, I was immediately told, I don't know where the painting is. And this illustrates, I think, both an awareness of Sultan's presence in London and the circulation of a story of one of his paintings that survives from the period. The open-air exhibitions, the selling of paintings in tube stations, and the remuneration of a landlord through a painting of the Taj Mahal all illustrate how London provided Sultan with a series of possibilities for informal modes of exhibition and the selling of his work that were facilitated by deep affective networks that ran through the East Pakistani, Bengali, and Sylheti communities of early post-colonial London. It shows that London provided a series of informal or semi-formal spaces for artists delinked from the circuits of formal invitations, exhibitions, or schooling that artists such as Zainul Abedin inhabited. Nevertheless, the informal art circuit through which Sultan journeyed could serendipitously link up to the formal economy of the fine arts in London at the time, in particular through large mixed shows held at commercial galleries. Now, such shows inspired great enthusiasm among amateur or Sunday painters, as illustrated in this 1952 editorial from the magazine The Artist. It says, quote, "A number of readers have been inquiring about the Leicester Gallery's exhibition Artists of Fame and Promise. In the main, exhibition at this show is by invitation from the gallery, i.e. please don't keep sending your stuff. Those who would wish to be considered for inclusion in this exhibition would be better advised to submit their work to the open exhibitions of the London societies, where their work may then be noticed by the proprietors of the Leicester Galleries, who may then extend an invitation to them," unquote. Now, I believe that this is the way that Sultan had his London exhibition. From his showing at one of the open exhibitions, either at Hampstead or the Victoria Embankment, he is invited to participate in the July 1952 Artist of Fame and Promise exhibition at the Leicester Galleries. The catalogue for this annual two-part summer show mentions a single work of S.M. Sultan, exhibit number 151 out of a total of 203 works shown, and this is in a room full of watercolors, linking back to Sanjukta's work. It is titled Winter Putney. From this, we might assume that this was a winter landscape, painted recently, probably not in Putney, London, but probably in Putney, New England, where Sultan had stayed as part of his US tour. The work had been priced as 14 guineas, but remained unsold. It is likely that the painting reverted to Sultan after the show. This has been the only concrete indication that I have been able to find of Sultan exhibited in London in the early 1950s, but that doesn't mean anything, of course. It shows that he was in London in 1952 and that he painted local scenes during international travels. This puts some claims about Sultan's early 1950s international travel in doubt, including the year of his presence in London, the types of subjects he painted. The assumption has always been that Sultan painted only landscapes from Bengal and Kashmir. But from this, it seems likely that Sultan also painted local scenes while traveling and put these up for show and sale. More significantly, Sultan's journey illustrates the existence of an interlinked set of more and less formal circuits of showing and exhibiting in early post-colonial London. Off the back of a very much formal tour of the US, Sultan's London sojourn was a far less clearly itinerated mode of travel, which drew on informal networks among London-based East Pakistani students, bohemians, restaurateurs, as well as various art societies, amateur groups, informal sites, roaming curators to produce, sell, and exhibit his work. Much of this happened off the radar of the formal art institutions and beyond the purview of curators, but this activity was nonetheless meaningfully connected to more formal sides of the art world, in which artists such as Sultan could then briefly appear. So to move to a joint conclusion that is titled An Itinerary That Overshoots Its Destination, the journeys of Zainul Abedin and S.M. Sultan through London in the early 1950s show a series of similarities and disjunctions. Situated at very different ends of the art worlds of London in the immediate decolonial period, their travels here can be described as such an itinerary that overshoots its destination. Both were propelled by politically informed and formal routes that emerged as part of an unfolding cultural logic of the Cold War. Both appeared in the former colonial metropolis in an ambivalent relation to its art worlds. While perhaps intended to produce a clear commitment to the international modern, either journey overshot this destination, encouraging in both a return to Bengal, where the image of the peasant, in very different ways, emerges as the central trope. Their contemporaries saw the moment of the early and mid-1950s, marked by these artistic journeys to London, Paris, and the US, as a turn towards abstraction. In the May 1954 issue, right before Sultan disappears off into the countryside, which he won't leave ever again, the studio, Jalaluddin Ahmed notes that, quote, S.M. Sultan now seems to have gone over completely to abstract art, unquote. Yet the transience of this moment has nonetheless rich analytical potential.
Now, this transience that I was talking about and Lotte kind of ended with, This transience is marked not only by the temporalities of journeys or the rhetorical staging of third world artists in post-imperial spaces like London, but also some very personal rejections of the artists themselves. In Abedin's case, a return to his pre-London idiom, this would be typical late 50s, the image of the bull coming up time and again, and a parallel discomfort that this triggered among his peers and students was marked by an almost defensive refusal to internalize a rationality of post-war modernism. Art for art's sake is not my faith, he says. I believe art is for human welfare, for making life harmonious and beautiful. I say time and again that our present famine is one less of food than of taste. This has to be eradicated, or else economic poverty and the poverty of taste will march in parallels. Our struggle, thus, is against both these poverties. A certain disquiet about the reappraisal of the folk, of the ethnographic and of the figurative in the works of both Abedin and Sultan can be discerned in the critiques of their works. Their embedding within the predictable modernist narrative has been urgent, both on part of collectors and art historians. But in their travels through London complicate such accounts. As their works refract through the multi-layered art worlds of London, they become parts of a potentiality that resides in an unfolding logic of post-colonial modernism. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.